What's up guys, Houndish here, and today we're jumping in with some Destiny 2 news, and this week we've actually got a pretty significant update from Bungie as part of their This Week in Destiny blog post. And they're breaking down a bunch of changes that we're going to see as part of the March update, which is launching on the 5th. Last week, Bungie previewed some new weapons that we'll see for playlists, and the weekly bundle of Bright Dust, but this time, they're talking about Sandbox adjustments. And so as a preview, the D2 team said there's a meaty twid this week, and they'll be covering upcoming weapon and ability tuning in Update 7.3.5, as well as Crucible-specific Sandbox changes. And for a quick rundown of PvE buffs, they say precision and high-impact rocket launchers will see changes, as well as heavy grenade launchers, including waveframes. There are changes for caster swords, the Edge of Action, the Exteris, and Vexmithoclast. And then inside of PvP, they say there are a bunch of changes for bows come in, as well as reduced Threaded Spectre uptime, adjustments to Threadling damage and making them easier to destroy, as well as changes for target lock on SMGs, and a whole bunch of other stuff which we'll round up in the video today. So, as always guys, I hope you enjoy this one, and if you do, a rating below very much helps us out. But now, without further delay, let's get into it. And so initially in the TWAB today, they give us a quick rundown of the ability changes that we'll see in the update on the 5th of March, and that includes a reduction in uptime for Threaded Spectre, a few changes to Threadlings to make them easier to deal with in Crucible, as well as a fix for the Restoration Timer extension issue, with a few corresponding changes to relevant solar fragments, and a small number of ability buffs that they're pulling forward from the balance pass in the final shape. And so firstly, for Ensnaring Slam, they've reduced the class ability regeneration penalty duration by 50% in PvE activities. So that should regen quicker, and for Threaded Spectre, they say it now applies the same class ability regeneration penalty used by Ensnaring Slam when the player creates a Threaded Spectre, but they have increased Threaded Spectre detonation damage by 25% versus PvE combatants. So Threaded Spectre getting a bit of a buff right there, as well as that adjustment primarily focused on PvP. But there are changes for Threadlings, and they've increased the aim assist shape size from 0.41 meters to 0.5 meters, and that essentially makes them easier to shoot inside of PvP. And they've reduced the base damage versus enemy players from 40 to 35, as well as fixing a couple of issues like groups of Threadlings not reliably chain detonating, and an issue where Threadlings sometimes didn't play their destruction performance when destroyed by enemy fire, resulting in them appearing to blip out of existence. There'll be some adjustments to Arcane Needle as well, and they say they're adjusting the aim assist and tracking strength, which makes it significantly more consistent against close to mid-range or fast-moving targets. So they've increased the aim assist angle by about 50%, as well as the aim assist fall-off distance from 30 to 45 meters. But they're also increasing how quickly the projectile can bend towards a target by around 5%, and the shape in front of the projectile that it uses to find targets. Plus they fixed an issue where uncharged melees while Arcane Needle is equipped resulted in the player appearing to freeze in a melee pose. But then we get adjustments to Restoration and Radiant, and they fixed an issue where the maximum duration of Restoration and Radiant buffs was being incorrectly stored, resulting in their buff timers resetting to the initial duration instead of the maximum when the buff was reapplied. And this also resolves a similar issue with the shorter restoration sources like Sunspots with the Sol Invictus aspect. Then for a couple of solar fragments here, for Ember of Mercy, it now extends your current restoration duration by 2 seconds when a Fire Sprite is collected, and if you don't already have Restoration active, collecting a Fire Sprite grants Restoration with a 2-second duration. And the Restoration extension is increased to 3 seconds while Ember of Solace is equipped. So that's good. And then for Ember of Empyrean, they increased the maximum duration extension from 12 to 15 seconds, and they've reworked the duration extension granted with a solar defeat. And the duration extension now varies based on the strength of the defeated target, and defeating an elite or weaker combatant will result in less time added, but defeating a champion or stronger combatant results in a greater extension. There'll also be some solar ability buffs, and for Sunbreakers they say they're improving the consistency of Consecration, and they've increased the travel distance of the initial ground follow, a projectile that follows along the surface like a Thermite Grenades wave or the Cold Snap Grenade Seeker, which goes from 18 to 20 meters. Plus they've increased the height of the Slam Ground Follow detonation by around 1 meter, and the travel distance of the Slam Ground Follow from 16 to 20 meters. Plus they're increasing the travel speed of the Slam Ground Follow from 16 to 24 meters per second. They also point out they're making adjustments to Gunpowder's Gamble's self-damage, which goes from a maximum of 144 right now down to 80, so hopefully that will be a little bit less self-lethal, I guess. So a few ability things right there, some of those descriptions a little bit technical, but let us know your thoughts thoughts on those down below. And here we get onto weapons. So for heavy burst hand cannons, they've corrected an issue that was causing them to have 25% less aim assist than other hand cannons when hip firing or airborne on mouse and keyboard, so that's a positive fix. And for bows, they've reduced the auto aim fall off distance start and end by 15%. That'll make aim assist less effective at longer ranges, plus they reduced the maximum auto aim cone size by 5%. And so bows in general will be a little bit less reliable at range. They also say they're adding a missing 12th perk, which is target lock, to Breakneck's second trait column, so Breakneck will be able to roll target lock now. And for lightweight scout rifles, overall, they're increasing base damage by 5%. Next up though, they say the rocket launcher meta has become more set than we'd like, and with adaptive and aggressive subfamilies outperforming the rest, they are making changes to precision and high impact subfamilies. So precision launchers will see increased reserve ammo by 2, and they're reducing the damage penalty from -10 to -5. For high impacts, the increased reserve once again by 2, and it now deals more detonation damage and less impact for roughly the same total damage, and it should make them more effective versus groups of enemies, or when getting splash damage on a target with a near miss. And it points out the above changes also affect Deathbringer, Galahorn, and Truth. Heavy grenade launchers will see some pretty significant changes, and they're increasing reserve ammo by a minimum of 6 rounds, and a maximum of 10 rounds depending on the grenade launcher. However, they are reducing spike grenades' impact damage buff from 50% to 12.5%, and this reduces the total spike grenades damage buff from about 8% to 3%, making them less mandatory. But they are increasing the direct hit damage by 10%, and combined with the above change, this brings non-spike grenade launchers almost up to the level of spike grenade launchers, and very slightly reduces the damage output with a spike grenade launcher. But in general, they're increasing detonation damage by 5%, and in PvP, this is offset by a reduction to the detonation damage for no overall change. And so spike grenades kind of getting hammered there, but everything else is certainly going to perform that bit better. For wave frame heavy grenade launchers though, they're increasing damage by 20% and increasing the wave width by 40%, so that's a pretty big buff. And on top of that, there are changes for caster swords, and they're reducing the heavy attack energy cost from 5 to 4, as well as increasing heavy attack damage by 16%, so I think another positive overall right there. And that takes us to exotics, where for Vigilance Wing, they say it now has a deterministic recoil pattern, so generally, it should be a bit easier to control. And they point out that Vex Mythoclast fires like a high impact auto rifle, but other high impact auto rifles have a larger aim down sight damage fall off scaler, so they've increased Mythos to match, and it goes from 1.5 times to 1.7 times. So more messing around with the Vex Mythoclast, and for Wishender, True Sight will now deactivate if you leave ADS or hold it for longer than 3 seconds, and to reactivate you must fully redraw the bow. So that'll be a noticeable change to that bonus. And next they say they hit the health of the Edge of Action bubble too hard, so they're increasing its damage resistance in PvE against all combatants except for bosses to 85%, and increasing its damage resistance against bosses to 15%. So that's another overall improvement for that one. Not sure if it will see more use because of it, but give us your thoughts below. And here they talk about the Manticore, where they want to address several usability issues. So players must now be airborne for 0.5 seconds and deal damage with the weapon to activate the perk, and that prevents accidental activation, but they gave it a special reload to quickly disengage anti-gravity thrusters. They point out that Taraba also receives this special reload animation, and while anti-grav thrusters are engaged, combatants will be less accurate when targeting the player, similar to the always on time Sparrow, and with the Catalyst, final blows and sustain damage with Manticore while airborne grant a void overshield and return ammo to the magazine. So an interesting one there, actually that's probably going to be worth trying out at the very least, as it could potentially be pretty good. Bungie also talk about the Exderis grenade launcher, and they say it ultimately wasn't hitting hard enough in PvE to be a top tier pick, so they're increasing the impact damage against PvE enemies by 50%, with the detonation damage being unaffected, and that makes the total damage increase to around 20%, varying by target type, but they've increased the maximum rate of fire by 17% as well. So it's another one to look out for. Give us your thoughts on those exotic changes, but here we've got a list of perk changes. So for Heal Clip, it now grants Cure ×2 to the player while still granting Cure ×1 to nearby allies. And for Trench Barrel, it can now be activated by dealing damage with ranged melee attacks. That's certainly an interesting change. And for Barrel Constrictor, they say, once it's activated, it no longer deactivates upon firing a shot, and it will last for 7.5 seconds, and buff all shots fired during that time. An Enhanced Barrel Constrictor will last for 8.5 seconds. They also want to make loose change more interesting in PvP, and they say applying a subclass 3.0 debuff now grants plus 20 aim assist and 20% reduced ADS movement speed, in addition to the existing plus 50% reload stat. Plus, applying another debuff will now refresh the duration as well. But then for dual loader, they say they've removed the reload speed penalty, and they've changed the wording of the perk description to make it clearer that it increases the number of shots reloaded, so we can now apply it to other weapon types without confusion in the future. So those are the sort of standard perk changes, but there are a couple of other additional elements here. So for text balance stock, it now grants plus 20 range and a 1.5 degree hipfire precision cone angle, in addition to the other effects, which makes it easier to land follow-up crits with hipfire. And for origin traits here, Hake Breach Armaments, Deconstruct, and Sundering now work against Void Souls, Strand Clones, Cabal Projection Shields, and Bricks. Plus for Hake Breach Armaments, the damage bonus versus Stasis Crystals has been reduced from 85% to 60% to match other constructs. So obviously that was an unintended element. They also want to make the Sundering bonus apply more broadly, so it can now trigger on a shield break in addition to final blows on vehicles and constructs. Plus, they added a small reload speed scaler while reducing the charge rate benefit to account for the higher uptime. So it may be slightly more useful in more content, but for Hatchling, they say it's a fun perk, but weapons that can technically crit but are bad at it suffer from precision kills being the only activator on certain weapon types, so activation requirements are no longer locked to the archetype in terms of precision or non-precision kills, and instead, the perk will trigger with either a precision kill or 3 non-precision kills. So that's a kind of cool one there. Next up though, for target lock, it now activates later in the magazine for SMGs, which will be at 20% instead of 12.5%, and so the damage buff will swing primary weapon gunfights less often. Also though, for Envious Assassin, they say each activation is now capped at 100% of magazine size instead of 150, and the maximum overflow is now 3 times the magazine instead of 4 times, so that one's not going to be quite as effective as it has been up until now. They also say that Bait and Switch is a little bit too strong in its current form. Unfortunately, that one gets a nerf, and they're reducing damage bonus from 35 to 30%, not massive. Plus they say a couple of extra fixes. For 1-2 punch, it now correctly deactivates after dealing damage with a powered melee, and for Deconstruct, they updated the perk description to correctly state that it pulls ammo from thin air and not reserves, and they fixed a bug preventing the perk from triggering when shooting an enemy Titan barricade. So let us know what you think about those, but they do say in the final shape we're rebalancing many weapon types in PvE, buffing underperforming weapons, and leaving most high performers untouched. And since we're looking at PvE weapon tuning anyway, over the course of the final shape year, we'll be looking at weapon mods that feel mandatory, and we intend to make some changes that will increase player choice, especially in PvE. Some more perk and mod changes are coming down the road when the final shape drops. But the final element's right here, and they say the following changes will be applied to the Crucible overall starting on March 5th, so player health will be increased by 30 health points in base Crucible, so players have 100 health up from 70, and between 116 and 130 shield depending on the player resilience value. Additionally though, for ability cooldowns, they say melee grenade and class ability cooldowns now have a 15% penalty applied to them in Crucible only. On top of that, super cooldowns now have a 20% penalty only in PvP. So these are some big cooldown changes for the Crucible. And for ability damage, for supers, they've increased base super damage by 31%, with base melee damage going up by 16%, and arc flux grenade damage boosting by 16% as well. And so it would appear actually a few sandbox elements are going to make PvP feel a little bit different. But for primary weapon archetypes, pulse rifles, autos, sidearms, and scouts will see increased critical hit damage by 14%. Then for hand cannons, they're increasing critical hit damage by 10%, as well as reducing body shot damage by 5%, and reducing flinch delta players by projectile impact by 12.5%, and by explosive payload by 10%. Plus for SMGs, they're increasing the critical hit damage by 12.5%, while reducing body shot damage by 3%. And there we can see as well, bows will see reduced base damage by 15% overall. And for special ammo, they say we'll start every game with 2 kills worth of special ammo for a chosen weapon, and instead of 2 kills worth of special ammo being granted every time you respawn, you'll earn 1 more ammo by filling up a special ammo meter. And points will be given for getting kills, assists, or completing objectives, and getting 100 points grants you 2 kills worth of special ammo for your chosen weapon. so that's been switched up quite significantly as well. But for special weapon archetypes, traces, shotguns, and fusion rifles, they're increasing base damage by 20%, and for glaives, base projectile damage goes up by 20%, with melee damage increasing by 16%. But finally for archetypes, here for heavy grenade launchers, they're reducing detonation damage by 5% and increasing the base damage of machine guns by 20%. And so on paper, once again, these look fairly significant, and I think that will probably translate to general Crucible gameplay. It also affects exotics, so Fighting Lion sees decreased damage versus players in Crucible by 20%, Devil's Ruin will see decreased charge beam damage against players by 15%, with Crimson seeing reduced flinch delta players by projectile impact by 17.5%. But finally for Forerunner, they've increased damage versus players in Crucible by 20% once again, and for Symmetry, they're increasing revolution damage versus players in Crucible by 16%. So as I said, overall, some pretty significant changes there and kind of a mixed bag in general. I believe these are some of the changes, especially for PvP, that they've been testing out in things like Crucible Labs. But for now guys, after doing a lot of talking, like I said, I think there are a mixture there, some positives, and certainly some things that players will think are negative, but overall some pretty significant changes, especially for PvP Sandbox. So let us know what you think about them down below, but if you found the video useful today, a rating very much helps us out. Keep in mind, these changes will be coming on the 5th of March. So once again, share your thoughts in the comment section and get subscribed so you can see more Destiny content down the road. But otherwise, I appreciate you tuning in, and I hope you guys have an awesome day.